Welcome. I'm Mark Eckenbach, and today I have a presentation for the Master Gardener program, and this one is a combination of two presentations that I've given in the past. And the combination of the two presentations, the first presentation is Petri dish to plate, and it's combined with garden mushrooms. So for those people that are very scientific driven, then the Petri dish to plate will probably get you thinking that direction. And for those of you that just want to grow some tasty mushrooms, then the garden mushrooms will probably be more of a path that you can take, or the combination of both, bring them both together. And mushrooms from your garden. These are mushrooms that I grew. These are oyster mushrooms, and they're part of a program that was put together. I did it to help a disabled vet for his income. At the peak of us selling mushrooms, we had 3 18-foot tents, and he had contracts locked up with the seller, and I believe Diablo's Kitchen, and a couple other places downtown. The business, his disabilities had gotten to the point that he couldn't manage the business, so the business now has been deconstructed, I guess you could say. References, of course, Paul Stamets has to be in here for talking about gourmet mushrooms. Growing Mushrooms the Easy Way by Dr. Wayne. And that, I believe, is a downloadable web book. And of course, over the years, this has been going on for about 10 years, Wayne Jones helped us while we were a commercial operation.
And Wayne Jones is former educator here in Bonneville County.
Oh, yes.
I took his place, not that I replaced him, but I'm here in his place. So
yes. Wayne Jones retired, and Ron moved into his place. For those that I guess I worked with Wayne for a year, I have forgotten. The kitchen table scientist, for those that are very scientific, and as a master gardener, I think you guys will be along this line also. There'll be some scientific stuff that you need to know about. The mushrooms that I know how to grow and what the requirements are blue oyster mushrooms, gray oyster mushrooms, pink oyster mushrooms, lion's mane mushrooms, and finally, king mushrooms. Each has its own growing requirements, and some are easier than others. So when we set up to grow our mushrooms, we basically have a battle of microbes going on. Mushrooms are fungus. Fungus can be classified in the microbe category. Bacterium, floating around in the air, fungi floats around in the air, molds float around in the air, yeast floats around in the air. This is how we get sourdough starter bread, is from yeast falling out into a place where it's multiplied. So with all these things surrounding us, in order to grow mushrooms, we're going to create an environment that allows microbes to grow really fast. What we need to do is be able to get our desired microbes to grow. And the microbes themselves, they compete for nutrients, and they leave behind the toxic waste product. And the toxic waste product is usually toxic to another type of microbe. So bacteria or mold will be toxic to our mushroom mycelium. So in order to win the battle of microbes, We need to rig the fight, sort of say, or at least give an advantage to who we want to be the champion. As they say in horse racing, we need to put the fix in. And your commercial growers, this is what they do. They make it a one-horse race. In other words, they take their culture, their medium, and they put it in a high-pressure, high-temperature autoclave. And this sterilizes their medium, which eliminates all the bacteria, all the other microbes, all the competition. So then they inoculate it, and it grows mushrooms because that's the only microbe that's there. The problem with this is that autoclaves are very expensive. They consume a lot of energy. There's safety precautions. It takes a permanent building. So the method that was developed or redeveloped is, I want to say, a non-sterile method of growing mushrooms, but it's sterile and non-sterile. We just try to make it as sterile as possible. And that's where our kitchen table scientists come in. So the first thing that you want to do is decide what type of mushroom culture you would like to grow. In this case, we have king oyster mushroom spawn that was obtained through eBay. It was shipped from the United Kingdom. On eBay, that's probably my largest supplier when I go looking. You can buy spores in liquid. You can buy mycelium cultures in petri dishes. You can buy spawn bags. The easiest way for me to work was with the actual spawn bags themselves. And just to propagate them, once I obtained the culture, then I would just continue to propagate that culture over and over and over and over and over again. To start the propagation process, we have 10 petri dishes, 15 petri dishes, and some hydrogen peroxide, some Ziploc baggies, and you squirt a little bit of hydrogen peroxide inside the petri dish, shake it around a bit, place those petri dishes in a Ziploc baggie and seal it shut. Then you place the Ziploc baggie with the petri dishes into the microwave, and you microwave them for approximately 20 seconds. If they get so hot that the petri dishes melt, take a little bit less time, so that you have basically between the hydrogen peroxide and the microwave, you have basically sterilized these petri dishes. Now we're going to give you a not so secret mushroom auger recipe. So if you're interested, if you type in any search engine, mushroom auger or mushroom auger recipe, then several will pop up. So here's a basic, what battery is low? So we're going to plug in the computer real quick.
Hopefully you'll get to reach that.
We'll make it.
It lied when it said there's an hour and a half, so.
And there we go. Okay, cool. Mushroom auger recipe, you can look on the internet, you can search, and you'll probably find several. The recipe that I give you here is pretty much very, very versatile for oyster mushrooms. Now, as far as oyster mushrooms are grown with oxygen and in light. So they require light and they require ventilation. So if you're thinking of button mushrooms, that's a completely different type of mushroom that I have not grown, so I have very little information on those other than a lot of people up north grow them in rooms. So our first ingredient that we're going to put into a quart mason jar are some wood pellets. Now the best type of wood pellet to have is a hardwood wood pellet. And there's a certain brand that's available at Sam's Club and Walmart at times, but Sam's Club usually is pretty good. Pentington product is oak, and these are just hard oak sawdust put into pellets. And we're going to add a full tablespoon of agar and about say 1 teaspoon of light malt, a 1/4 teaspoon of flour, just regular flour, and also a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast nutrient, and about a 1/2 teaspoon of chinchilla food. This is alfalfa pellets, basically. But I found that out of all the products that are alfalfa products, chinchilla food has the complete nutrients that seem to work best for oyster mushrooms. And then you can either measure 100 milliliters of water or just fill the mason jar about halfway full. We're going to take our agar mixture and we're going to put it into a pressure cooker. Now notice that I have the pressure cooker lids upside down. And the reason for that is when we take the agar out of the pressure cooker, we're going to want to pour this. And if the lids are up to where the seals will seal, then it gets a little bit messy, and agar is very sticky and dangerous when it's hot because it sticks and it's slimy. So it's best just to have the lids upside down as a safety issue so they don't stick. And after 15 minutes of pressure at 15 pounds, then we'll remove them. And we're going to pour the agar into the Petri dishes. 1 halfway filled quart mason jar will fill approximately 15 Petri dishes. Now I work with my Petri dishes. I wet a towel and place it over the table. Then I take my sterile Petri dishes and lay them out. Do not lift the lids with the exception of just pouring in the agar itself. The wet towel has a tendency to sort of keep the high humidity in that localized area, has a tendency to help keep any microbes from joining into the fun. So after we've poured our agar into the dishes and the agar has cooled to room temperature, then we're ready to inoculate each of the Petri dishes. And that can be done with the spawn that you ordered online, or it can be done with mushrooms that you go buy in the store, or it can be done with a Petri dish from the last batch that you propagated. In this case, we're going to show one of the Petri dishes that was propagated from previous. I have my scalpel in an alcohol bath, and I have a little alcohol lamp to flame off my scalpel in between cuts. So there's the Petri dish that was propagated from the previous batch. And I'm just going to cut out a little tiny section, and you can see where it was inoculated previously with a couple little pieces of agar that carried the mycelium with it and made the spawn Petri dish. And so each one of the Petri dishes will be lifted up, inoculated, and closed, lifted up, inoculated, and closed. Then those Petri dishes will be restacked, placed into a gallon Ziploc bag, and set aside for them to mature into a mature mycelium in the Petri dish. The other method that I said, besides getting the spawn sack from eBay, is you can just go to the store and purchase mushrooms. In this case, this is the mushrooms from Canada Winco Special. picked up. And now we're going to get into a little bit of the easier type method. And so we have the mushrooms, we have a gallon Ziploc baggie of the chips. In that, I put in a 1/4 cup of chinchilla food. And the first thing I'm going to do is sterilize my plate with some rubbing alcohol. Very difficult to find right now, but even wouldn't necessarily have to use rubbing alcohol. I'm sure that high alcohol drinkable would work. So with the plate sterilized, then I take a mushroom and wash it with hydrogen peroxide. And you can see down, let's see, you can see how it's foaming up a bit there. So it's attacking some sort of microbe there, resulting in the release of oxygen, resulting in the release of bubbles. And I just took my little scalpel, which happened to be a kitchen knife that I sterilized, and chopped up several pieces. And then I just placed, instead of the mature agar, I just take a piece of mushroom and lay it into a petri dish with freshly poured agar. These will be set aside, and they will, if they're not contaminated too badly, they will grow into a mature petri dish of mycelium. You can take the rest of the mushrooms, wash them with the hydrogen peroxide, and this is our Pentington wood pellets, and these are oak. They're available for 50 pounds, usually about $7 at Sam's Club. Instead of chinchilla chow, rabbit chow works really well for the bigger process. They're alfalfa pellets with some extra nutrients added, and I usually use probably about 1/4 cup for a gallon of the gallon sack of the chips. And if you have a little bit of hydrated lime around, that may come in handy when we make artificial blobs. So with enough moisture to make the wood chips dissolve, and to where if you pour some in your hand, the friability test, when you squeeze it, it doesn't fall apart, but you can't squeeze any water out of it. So that's the moisture content that you want. And then in each gallon sack, you want to add about a 1/4 cup of hydrogen peroxide. And to that, you add the chopped up mushrooms, shake them up, and set those aside. So these were produced on the kitchen table on the 5th, I believe the 5th. And then I rephotographed them on the 7th. And this is the 1 gallon sack. And you can see that the mushrooms have started putting the mycelium into the wood sawdust. And that's a really good sign right there. And I brought the gallon sack, but it's a really good sign when the corner or any part of the sack starts to form this discoloration, this golden.
So they can't see you pointing, you have to use the mouse on it.
Oh, they can't?
Yeah.
Okay, they can't see me.
Okay, so they see a little tiny screen of you, but your
Oh,
presentation
okay.
is the big thing, so.
Good, well, thank you very much. Okay, so
So just kind of move your pointer, your mouse pointer, and that'll,
Okay, there we go.
there you go.
So this is a really, really good sign. See how dark and golden this is starting to get? And see how solid the mycelium is starting to go in here? And if you look at spawn sacks, when you purchase them commercially, you'll see that whether they're on sawdust or grain, they're normally on grain, you'll see that the mycelium is just solid in there holding. And it's a very healthy culture when this is solid and hard. Also with the, now that was after about 5 days. And then here are the Petri dishes after 5 days. And here we have the mushroom, and the mycelium is starting to grow out into the agar. We also have some contaminated Petri dishes where the battle is going to start. We have a piece of mushroom that's growing out. We have blue mold, and we have slime mold. So depending on which environment's best for the microbe is going to depend on which one wins. In this case, the blue mold won. I did not sterilize this agar very well. So after about 2 to 3 weeks, your spawn is what we're going to call it now. Your spawn sack that that you made up with the wood sawdust will become solid, and it'll be ready for use. Also, when you order it from the commercial grower, if you order a spawn sack, you'll see that the spawn comes ready for use also. So if you just want to skip the entire step of propagating and order your spawn, you can start with spawn that you order and proceed from there. Now we're going to make up either mushroom bags or artificial logs. And what comes in real handy for a small commercial, or not small commercial, but for the home grower is a 5-gallon bucket and a tool to pull the lid off and a mallet to close the lid. And what we're going to do is add water to our wood chips in the 5-gallon bucket. And once again, we're going to get to the point where when you squeeze it, no water comes out, yet when you let go, it still holds its shape. That's about the right moisture content. Now, if you are growing oyster mushrooms and you're using oak from the pellets, a teaspoon of lime is a good thing to add. It just helps a little bit, take the pH basic just a bit. The oyster mushrooms tend to like them. If you are trying to grow lion's mane mushrooms or king mushrooms, then you need to get your pH into a very specific range. And I would suggest that you look at Paul Stamets' book for the pH of what's required there. Pink oyster mushrooms, though they look really pretty, they're very difficult to grow because they stop growing if it gets too cold and they stop growing if it gets too hot. So there's a temperature band there that they're most sensitive to. But the gray and blue oyster mushrooms are hardy, and they don't seem to care too much. Once they get started, then they become real champions in growing. So you take your spawn bag and you mix it into your medium, snap the lid on, shake that 5-gallon bucket around, up and down, around, roll it around, kick it. When we were producing commercially, we had a cement mixer. We would put the wood chips into a cement mixer along with the moisture and the cement mixer did all the mixing for us. And then at that point, you can pour out into mushroom bags. In this case, I'm pouring out into some garbage liners that are inside a box or a mold. Garbage bags are sterile until you open them up. The wood chips, or the wood pellets, since they are compressed at high temperatures and high pressures, they're sterile until you open the sack and allow them to be exposed. And pretty much because they're pellets, the alfalfa pellets are sterile also. So these are some of the advantages that you're working towards. We aren't in a completely sterile environment, but we're trying to use what we can for sterile products. And after the bags become completely infused with mycelium, you'll start to see your first flush. Oyster mushrooms will generally give you about 3 flushes of mushrooms. And depending on how intense you want to do this, when we first started experimenting with this, our first tent was an inverted bin with holes cut in it to allow oxygen to flow, and it was set upside down in the laundry room. Our second and third tents consisted of some plastic shelving that we put plastic around and then humidifier inside. Our fourth was a greenhouse that we covered with insulation and placed a heater and a humidifier inside and started growing in mushroom bags. From this step, then Jason was able to go from 1 to 3 18-foot tents, and his business was located in the old Navy building. People know that are familiar with Idaho Falls. That is the 550 2nd Street, is where the growing facility was. And then one of the byproducts that you have is the spent bags when they're done. And they can be used to grow mushrooms in your garden. So to make a false log or a mushroom log, there's 2 methods that I use. One is with 1/2-inch hardware wire. You cut it out and crimp the ends so that you have cylinders. And another is just using snow fence. The snow fence is a lot gentler on the fingers. And then you take your medium and you just fill up the artificial log that you've created. In this case, this is my experiment where I just took the mushrooms from the store, chopped them up, put them in a gallon Ziploc baggie, let that spawn grow to a solid mass, broke that up in a 5-gallon bucket with 5 gallons worth of pellets, and just poured it in there. Then I took it out, well, I poured it outside. This is the north side of my house, up against my house where it stays in the shade constantly. Then all I did was keep them moist from that point on. They created mushrooms, or they grew mushrooms. You can see the flush going on right there. This experiment is, I took some spent mushroom bags and created an artificial log with the snow fence. And I placed them inside my pole beam tent to provide the shade. And after the pole beams grew up a ways, you can see that there was a flush that occurred on this artificial log also. So the point here is that you can get as complicated as you want with going with the Petri dishes and propagating and continuing the propagation and going into growing them inside a tent, all the way up to selling them commercially. Or you can be as simple as picking up some hydrogen peroxide, some wood pellets from some Pentium wood pellets, some rabbit chow, making up a couple Ziploc baggies with mushrooms that you purchase at the store, mixing them into artificial logs and growing them outside in your garden for approximately $20 total cost. And there's the mushrooms inside the bean. And there is the mushrooms inside the cucumbers and beans, though you can't see really much that it's there. So it was well shaded, well watered. And that is the harvest. Those mushrooms are about the size of a small dinner plate. That pan that they're on is the bottom of an oven that you put inside for a roaster to catch all the drippings inside an oven. So that's about 25 inches by 18 inches. So that will give you an idea of the size of those mushrooms. Now, there's one difference that I know for growing mushrooms inside and out. And if you grow the mushrooms inside a tent, then all you have is the mushrooms for the flavor. Anything that's grown outside, I found, it has a tendency to pick up flavors from the earth. So they're more earthy if they're grown outside where they're exposed to other things, different pollens that are in the air. Some of them even tasted a little bit like dill, because I've let dill go to seed and can't get rid of it. So I just let it continue. So that's dill. Then at the end of the season, just kick them over when they get done producing. And in my garden, since I'm a trencher, then they were trenched into the soil and recycled back into tomatoes for the next year. Does anybody have any questions? Is anybody there?
We got 21 people on, so that's pretty.
Oh, do we?
Yeah.
That's impressive. Anybody have any questions?
And so feel free to unmute yourselves, and
Yes, yes, please.
if anything in the chat, Lena, you check the chat, see if there's anything in the chat there.
Not so far. I'll ask a question though.
Sure.
So I've got two unsightly stumps in my front flower bed. I
Yes.
was not allowed to remove them because of a gas line. Could
Okay.
I make one of these mushroom logs around the stump if I just left that gap and filled it in?
Okay, what type of stumps? What type of trees? Do you know?
I have a juniper and an arborvitae.
Okay, conifer trees and oyster mushrooms do not do well. The pine, I'm not too sure exactly what makes it difficult for oyster mushrooms to grow on conifers. But I found with experimenting with paper pellets and conifer pellets and hardwood pellets, that the only thing that the oyster mushrooms really will grow on healthy is a hardwood. Now, I have transferred these artificial logs onto elm, and they've taken off onto elm, and people have told me years later that when the seasons are correct and the watering's just right, the oyster mushrooms pop up out of the stump. So once inoculated, the stumps will stay inoculated. But unfortunately, I don't know of any mushrooms that will degrade your conifer stumps. Ron, any?
There are probably some out there, they may not be edible. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, but what's out there, yeah, might not be edible. But that's a good question, because I've had people inoculate their own stumps, and if once inoculated, these oyster mushrooms, the grays, blues, and the whites, they are tough. And once they establish themselves, they just keep on going. Even after 3 flushes and making the artificial log out of spent mycelium, just busting them up and was enough to get 2 solid flushes out of them in the bean tent. So.
Okay, Mark, we have someone that asked, what about willow stumps and what about a birch tree?
Birch and willow, I think, would be just fine. I think that would, I think you could probably inoculate them, and yes, they would probably produce mushrooms in the right atmosphere or environment. Yes.
That'd be a really good use of a willow tree.
Yes, it would. Other than using it for, let's see, I like willow for like a growth hormone. Just smashing up willow bark and using it for a rooting compound.
Yeah, willows, yeah, they root very readily.
Yes, they do. Yeah, so I would say that, yes. Any other questions?
Mark, we got another question. Somebody asked, if using stumps, would there be a risk of other types of mushrooms coming?
Yes. Anything that's exposed to the atmosphere has the possibility of being inoculated themselves. To inoculate a stump, I didn't bring any pictures. I'll try to describe. If you can get like a 1-inch wood bore and a hand brace, so that you can auger out about a 4-inch deep 1-inch hole into the stump and make several of those holes. Then you mix up the spawn in a 1-gallon sack, and once it becomes solid, then you wet your stump really well and pour some hydrogen peroxide on it with those holes and just smash your spawn into those holes, and then just keep it wet for a couple days, and that stump will absorb some moisture, and pretty soon it'll come into a balance and the mycelium will migrate into the stump itself. And with oyster mushrooms, they really are super tough, and once they start in a good environment, it's pretty hard for anything else to displace them in their growth.
Okay, so we have a question. How about creating toxic mushrooms when missing out on the sterilization? I'm guessing they're wondering if that's a risk.
Well, the sterilization, as far as like the Petri dishes, because that's about the only thing we're sterilizing. We're using Ziploc baggies, which are sterile to begin with. The wood pellets are pretty sterile. The rabbit chow's sterile. Lime's going to be pretty sterile. Hydrogen peroxide helps provide oxygen and helps get rid of a little bit of microbes that are there. So there really is, if you inoculate with oyster mushrooms, and you know what those oyster mushrooms should look like when they're mature, then they should be oyster mushrooms that grow. You're going to create an environment, especially with oyster mushroom spawn, that will create a edible oyster mushroom. I don't know, and I can't be taken 100%. I don't know of a toxic mushroom that looks like an oyster mushroom, but we didn't have any problems with any toxic mushrooms invading our stuff. Whether I created artificial logs or stumps, or whether we were growing them commercially inside tents. I hope that answers the question. I don't know of any reason to grow toxic mushrooms on purpose. And the oyster mushrooms they really are just soldiers when it comes down to once they get established in the right environment.
Okay, so then somebody else asked, have you tried to grow other types of mushrooms, such as wine caps? Any thoughts on those? How about morels?
Okay, from my research, reading through Paul Stamets' book, morel mushrooms are almost impossible to grow through, let's see, they're very difficult to grow commercially, very difficult to grow even if people know how to grow mushrooms. There might be some kits out there that you could try and read the directions. As far as like bottle cap mushrooms or wine cap mushrooms, a completely different growing environment. What I know for like button mushrooms, they require a medium mostly of like compost that has to be sterile and that they need to be grown in a low light atmosphere. And I'm sure they probably need some sort of ventilation. Oyster mushrooms require light and require oxygen. So I don't have too much information, but I would go get Paul Stamets' Gourmet Mushrooms book, and he will list his research on what he has found as far as being able to reproduce those in the home environment and commercially.
Okay, and then somebody wanted to know, are cold winters killing the process in the stumps?
The cold winters kill the mycelium once it's inoculated. For oyster mushrooms, no. No, they are tough. I took what are called some slants when I first started, which was just a little sliver of some mycelium on agar and put them in test tubes. And a year later, I was able to rehydrate those slants, and they grew in petri dishes and produced mushrooms. So they can go dormant. And I know that people that have inoculated stumps, when the environment's correct, the oyster mushrooms pop back out of those stumps. So our cold winters do not kill the mycelium, no. All right. All right, well, thank you, everybody. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me and I'll try to help you out. If anybody's interested in growing commercial, come talk to me and I can give you some pointers. And especially if you know anybody that may be handicapped, because it's a good source of income for people that, such as disabled veterans.
Less mobile people.
Less mobile people and people that may have a difficult time being employed elsewhere. They might be able to be self-employed, growing something year-round. Because inside a building, you can grow these mushrooms year-round. So thank you very much.